cameras are rolling.
So I often tell people that Addison walked into that hospital the day that she was admitted into the ICU. And then she walked into the triage room and she climbed up onto the stretcher. And that would be the last time she would put her feet on the floor for over 4 months. She didn't leave a bed for over 4 months. In 2011, Addison was 11 years old, and she was what you would call physically perfect. I don't think she could have been in any better shape. She had just finished track meet, so she had trained for weeks for that. She had just finished playing volleyball on a team. She was doing well in school. She had lots of friends. One Sunday, she started to complain that her hip hurt. And I didn't think too much of it because she's so active. Sports injuries weren't uncommon. She woke up in the middle of the night and came and complained about her hip again, and it just wasn't like her. So the next morning, I made her an appointment to see our family doctor. But before we could get there, the pain got so severe that I actually took her to the hospital, took her to the emergency room. They had diagnosed her with a virus. But the doctor was concerned enough that they drew some blood cultures. The next day, she looked much, much worse. So I took her back to the hospital. And it was that day, while we were in that ER, she went from being very sick, and she looked really, really sick, to septic shock. She went into shock in the ER. Her blood pressure started to drop. She started to get very short of breath, and she needed oxygen. And they took her to the pediatric ICU at 9 o'clock that night. An infectious disease doctor came in to see us, and he said, "Your daughter is very sick. She has bacteria in her blood. She has sepsis." And as a nurse, I knew what that was. But as a mom, I was terrified. Over the last few days, she went from perfectly normal and healthy, playing, doing sports and all the things she did every day, to lying in a hospital bed with so many tubes and wires and machines I couldn't even keep count anymore. Even though the doctor really didn't hold out a lot of hope that she would make it even 24 hours, she did. She surprised everyone and was even doing a bit better. They didn't have any sensitivity results back yet, but they did know that it was staph. And so they decided to change her antibiotics to drugs that were better targeted towards staph. And 24 hours after they had changed the antibiotics, she was actually much worse. She had to be intubated. The bacteria had invaded her lungs, and so she had developed a bacterial pneumonia, and they had to sedate her. I don't remember exactly how much longer it was, but it was another day at least before they got their sensitivity results back. And when they did, everyone was surprised to learn that the bacteria that was in her blood was not really susceptible to those antibiotics that they thought should work. And in fact, they weren't working, and that's why she was getting so much sicker. So they did switch her back to the broad-spectrum antibiotics, but those hours and days that she was on the wrong antibiotic really cost her. During the time that Addison was on the wrong antibiotics, the bacteria in her lungs really took hold, and the bacterial pneumonia became very severe. Once that happens, there's really not much you can do. You can't force the lungs to work any better when they're that sick. And the only alternative at that point is a machine called ECMO. A lot of people think of it as the heart-lung bypass machine that you would use during open heart surgery. It can be used for people whose lungs are failing, severely failing, and that's what was happening to Addison. So the doctors made the decision to put 2 really big tubes into her arteries and veins and take blood out, put it into this machine that would take the CO2 out of her blood and put oxygen in just like your lungs do, and then they put the blood back into her body, and it just runs constantly. Anytime you take blood out of someone and run it through a machine, it changes the way the blood clots. And so people who are hooked up to ECMO have to have a lot of medication that stops their blood from clotting, what we think of as blood thinners. She was hooked up to the ECMO machine for a total of 94 days. This is a machine that's usually used for hours or days, not weeks. probably 2 months into the time that she was on that machine, she did have a stroke. Her right brain was affected. There was a huge brain bleed. She had picked up several infections while she was in the hospital-acquired infections. And it's worth noting that each and every one of those hospital-acquired infections turned out to be resistant to the antibiotics that would usually be chosen to treat those infections. And each time, she was sicker longer than she needed to be because we didn't know which antibiotic would work. 5 months in the ICU, that's a very long time to stay in an ICU unit. At first, I think I just believed that, she'd get better soon. She would get better soon. But the damage to her lungs from that bacterial infection was so severe that her lungs, eventually we learned that her lungs just would never heal. And so then we started looking at other alternatives. Lung transplant was the last hope. I often found myself thinking about driving home from the hospital without her for the last time. I saw other families do that. I watched families walk down the hall with all of their children's things and no child. And I would think, I'm not going to need a minivan anymore. But we brought her home. But what happened to her affected our family in ways that I can't even begin to describe. My husband's no longer with us. And I know in my heart that if she hadn't gotten so sick, he'd still be here. I also think it's really important to note that if Addison's doctors had had access to some technology, some way to have known which antibiotic to give her, which one would have worked well from the beginning on the infections that she had, the first one, the staph infection, and the other infections that she got in the hospital, I feel certain that her course would have been dramatically changed. That little bit of knowledge could have changed a lot of lives, not just hers. Even though we had good health insurance through my work, really good health insurance, her hospital bill just from the first stay, those 5 months in the ICU, was almost $8 million. And that was just the beginning. In the last 6.5 years, I think it would be fair to estimate that we're now approaching $12 or $13 million. And if you look at what it will cost her over the rest of her lifetime, just to stay alive, the medications and the constant care that she requires, the specialized care because of her transplant, the probable need for another transplant, the certainty that she will be hospitalized again, probably an average of twice a year for different illnesses. I think we could easily say another $10 or $15 million if she were to live another 10 or 15 years. It would not be unreasonable to think that at all. It didn't have to be this way.
Hi, I'm Addie, I'm 18, and statistically, I shouldn't be here. I'm a bit of a miracle. I call myself the stereotypical teenager. I like Supernatural, I like computers, I like my phone, I love to be on social media, I love sleeping. Like, oh my god, sleeping is the best thing in the world. And I love furry, cute things that will cuddle with me. Currently, I'm a senior, and so what I want to do for a job has not changed. Teaching special education children is like one of the most important things to me. I've thought about having kids, but then I realized, there's the dirty diapers and the spit up and the insurance and the taking them to school and signing all the papers and, buying a big enough house for them. And I kind of thought, well, I don't want to do that. I'm kind of lazy. I like hanging out in bed and watching TV and chatting with people online. And so I decided I could teach younger children possibly, because then, you get a couple hours of fun with them, but then you get to come home and you get to just decompress. I have a lot of denial on what happened to me because it's probably a very unhealthy way to deal with this, but I block it all out. I just push it deep down and hope for the best. And that's probably why I'm so, like, messed up mentally sometimes. I'm a glass building held together by tape. You take so much for granted, and then, you know, like I took my own lungs for granted and they're gone, but it's okay. I'm gonna get them back. They're using stem cells these days to cure cancer, and to think they can grow an organ or multiple organs out of your own stem cells would be amazing. And to have my own lungs again would probably be really, really cool. I don't want to be the lung transplant kid anymore. Like, I just want to be normal. I am obsessed with Batman, like probably an unhealthy obsession, somewhat. He's a normal person with a really horrible past. Something really horrible happened to him. And it's kind of like, wow, that happened to me. And he gets past it, maybe not in the best ways, but he does. And he goes out there and he fights for what's right. And that's kind of how I feel that I am, because, you know, I'm so into making sure everyone's accepted, you know. I just want everything to be good in the world. And that's what Batman does. And he's changing the world, and I want to change the world. How? I'm not sure how yet, but I will. One way or another.